silence, the chaotic sounds of that distant battlefield, the high-pitched clashing of swords, the war cries, and the roar of fluttering banners in your mind for just a moment. Because for us, the real war is not fought there, far away from that noise, in a damp, dim room illuminated by candlelight. Listen to the scratching of ink drops on thick parchment and the heavy, dull thud of gold coins being counted on the table. We have been told censored lies about medieval history. We were taught that history is written by kings, conquerors, and emperors who were the shadows of God on earth. For centuries, we read about their diamond-studded crowns, their so-called divine rights, and the exaggerated epics of heroism in blood-washed squares. The gleam of magnificent armor mesmerized the masses so much that while everyone focused on this passive theater on stage, most people missed the actual truth. History books wrote of the victories of kings, yes, but we were rarely told about their massive debts hidden between the lines, their secret bankruptcies, the crushing state debts taken with exorbitant interest in the cold corridors of marble palaces, and the intrigues revolving around the Game of Thrones. In the foggy and ruthless world of the Middle Ages, a king could command an army of tens of thousands. He could order them to die, but he could not pay that army's wages, provisions, and armor on his own. A monarch could declare war on the seas with the seal of his noble office, but he could not find the timber to build his fleet and the financing to float those ships alone. In the Middle Ages, wars were spoken of from mouth to mouth, but no one talked about a noble aristocrat abandoning his subjects for the sake of his concubines. No one dared to mention their paid escorts or the mistresses who could often spell the doom of a kingdom. If you had lived in the Middle Ages, while looking with admiration at those mighty men sitting on the throne, thinking they ruled the world with their scepters, you would have actually missed the most important, the most dangerous person in the room. Look at the man silently watching from the shadows behind the thrones, keeping the account of everything. The bot without armor, holding a quill pen instead of a sword, and a heavy black-bound ledger. The power of a king ends the moment he sees the bottom of his treasury. But the power of the man in the shadows begins exactly when that treasury runs dry. No one in the Middle Ages even noticed these men hiding in the shadows, keeping the forbidden ledgers. The true Middle Ages is colder and more clinical than history books would ever dare to write. The crown was merely an aesthetic symbol designed to force the masses into obedience, while noble dynasties and ostentatious ceremonies were nothing but a massive public relations illusion. Gold was the absolute and undeniable sole liquidity, and those mysterious men standing in the dark behind the throne knew this very well. History is not just a series of wars, treaties, and divine rights. History is a ruthless case of debt and credit, a macroeconomic leveraged transaction. That is why no massive army in the Middle Ages could embark on a campaign without a treasurer's credit approval and risk analysis. In this series, we will not talk about those who started the wars, but those who financed them. Not those who sat on the thrones, but the invisible, mysterious hands that liquidated those thrones overnight. However, the default of great empires did not solely depend on emptied treasuries and liquidity crises. We will also expose those flawless, data miner, female spies who manipulated the decisions of kings through intimate diplomacy, infiltrating the dimmest room of palaces like Trojan horses. Hiding behind aesthetics and carnal desire, we will decode these female spies, beautiful enough to manipulate the emotions of even kings, turning the vulnerabilities of powerful men into hedonistic investments. These bedroom agents who overturn the balance sheets of entire nations overnight with secrets whispered amidst silk sheets were the sharpest weapons of the Council of Shadows. Now we descend to where the swords fall silent, and those blackmail-filled forbidden ledgers are opened. To the center of true power, and the invisible swift networks that operated even above states. We enter that dark medieval financial universe of those wealthier than kings, where not crowns, but algorithms, market manipulations, and hostile takeovers reign. If you're ready, Richer Than Kings is about to begin. The forbidden books are now being opened. Welcome to the mysterious pages of the Archive of Golden Thrones. For centuries, the feudal system that captivated Europe appeared as a flawless, unshakable marble pyramid. At the very top was God, holding absolute power. Just below him, the king, representing that power on earth. Then the noble lords, protecting the land and borders with their swords. And at the very bottom, millions of peasants, born in the mud, dying in the mud, existing solely to produce. This medieval hierarchy was thought to be as sharp and unchangeable as the laws of the sky. According to the aristocracy, power resided in the noble blood, flowing through veins and the weight of the gold one possessed. A peasant could never be a lord, and a merchant had no rights other than to kneel before the king. The system was sealed with the sword, with fear, and with absolute obedience. But as the 13th century arrived, a silent, profound, and unstoppable revolution was launched in the damp streets and ports of Europe. The owners of this revolution did not wear shining armor, ride noble horses, or shout war cries. They called themselves the Council of Shadows, an ancient organization whose existence is as old as history itself, with roots stretching back to Assyria and Babylon. Those who worshipped solely the power of knowledge, willing to do anything to possess it at any cost. They preserved and passed down this occult knowledge for generations within their cult. This dark and mysterious formation, which continues its existence even today, did not wage the revolution they started on a bloody battlefield. It was written in the dim urine and raw wool-scented rooms of Florence, Augsburg, and Flanders, in the vaults of cathedrals, under the faint light of a candle, in the underground temples of Jerusalem. The fate of wars was no longer determined by the clashing of commanders' swords, but by the scratching of quills etched onto thick parchments. The crude and primitive power of the sword gave way to the freezing coldness of mathematics. The famous double-entry bookkeeping and balance sheets. The Council of Shadows was introducing a brand new, mutated asset class onto the stage of history they had prepared for centuries. Bankers, usurers, global merchants, and financial spies. These ordinary people, lacking noble blood and not belonging to the magnificent and arrogant world of palaces, began capital accumulation at a speed unprecedented in history. The silk merchants in Florence, the wool barons in Flanders, and the mining owners in Augsburg created massive liquidity pools that would eclipse the century-old treasuries of states for years. To them, the borders of kingdoms, holy wars, or nationalities were mere revenue items. Their only religion was supply, demand, and maximized profit margins. The marble walls of the feudal pyramid, once thought unshakable, were now slowly being crushed by shadows living in the temples of a different pyramid, cracking under the weight of gold coins and increasing credit risks. In the past, a king ruled his subjects with a single edict and sent his army to death with a single command. But in this new order, it was no longer the shape of the war that mattered, but its economics. Copper was needed for the soldiers' armor, iron for their weapons, and most importantly, regular gold for the loyalty of those soldiers. The king had an army, yes, but now to meet the operating costs of that army, he needed the approval of this new class, the men in the shadows, or rather, their credit limits. The merchants and bankers did not have personal armies because they didn't need to bear that primitive cost. Instead of swinging swords and shedding blood, they learned the methods of buying kings and massive armies wholesale by utilizing the open positions in the market. This silent and ruthless rise of the Council of Shadows' capital was unknowingly turning kings into captives on their own thrones, in their own palaces. These ordinary men from the shadows, with massive funds and the limitless liquidity they managed, were establishing a shadow authority above those with noble blood, unchecked by any law. The fate of wars and the expansion of borders no longer depended on the military genius of kings, but on the interest rates and maturities of debts offered by the bankers. Ink and wisdom had long since defeated the sword, and the sword wasn't even aware of it yet. In the city of Augsburg, Germany, in an unpretentious office, the crackling of burning wood in the fireplace blended with the cold rhythmic and calculating clicks of the wooden beads of a massive abacus. At one end of the heavy oak table, in the center of the room, sat Jakob Fugger, nicknamed Jakob the Rich. At the other end was Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain, the owner of a massive empire on which the sun never set, considered the most powerful man in the world. In the cold streets of Augsburg outside, the public believed Charles possessed divine power. However, in this dim office, behind closed doors, no divine law applied. Here, Only the freezing and ruthless rules of mathematics functioned. The young King Charles felt this to his bones. As Fugger looked at this very young emperor sitting nervously in his gold-embroidered cloak across from him, he did not see the mighty ruler the masses saw. In his eyes, Charles was merely a highly risky, leveraged transaction, heavily indebted, and on the brink of bankruptcy due to his open positions. Just a few years prior, in 1519, when a deadly race for that throne was entered with the King of France, it wasn't Charles's military genius that persuaded the noble-blooded princes and electors holding the votes. What secured the electors' votes was a massive bribery fund of exactly 835,000 florins that came out of Fugger's vaults. The imperial crown was not won by shedding blood on the battlefield. It was bought with cash on Fugger's table through a flawless investment strategy. When Charles, from the other end of the table, in a muffled voice, trying to maintain his pride, requested the extension of his debt maturities and new military funding for upcoming wars, Fugger's expression did not change. He slowly dipped his quill into the inkwell. He did not respect the emperor because he had created that empire himself. The massive Spanish armies behind Charles, or the prayers of bishops, could not intimidate Fugger. A banker's only collateral was his ledger, and the only thing that kept kings honest was their need to borrow again in the future. As the young king conveyed his request and left the banking office with his delegation, Fugger slowly leaned over the parchment and began to write that famous, most insolent yet realistic collection notice history has ever seen. As the lines became clear in the light of the fireplace fire, that cold German discipline within him poured into words. The lines he poured into the text as his pen scratched the paper were actually the financial unofficial constitution of all of Europe. Your Majesty must know very well. If it were not for my gold, those massive funds I financed, you would never have been able to put that imperial crown on your head. Now, along with this last credit, I demand that you repay all your debts to me as soon as possible. This was not a threat. This was an asset manager securing his capital at risk. Charles walked out of that office, receiving the new credit approval he wanted. The crown was still on his head. The empire was still his. But Fugger hadn't just given that gold away. In return, he had purchased the monopolies of copper and silver mines across Europe, the future tax revenues of the Spanish throne, meaning the tomorrows of a massive empire. The king wore the crown true, but the bankers now owned the future of that kingdom. This new and invisible authority descending upon politics was creating not only the fate of empires, but also the largest profit gateway of the system. Because in this order, lending to kings was profitable, but their inability to repay those debts is far more profitable. Fugger knew this very well before he even lent to the king. The magnificent walls of empires look impenetrable from the outside. Yet the inside of those walls is actually a tower of debt full of cracks. What shadows the victories kings win on the battlefields is the cost of those victories. When an emperor marches his armies into a campaign, he fights not only with steel, but also with gold. And when the gold runs out, a silent crisis begins. When the king sees the bottom of his treasury, his treasurers knock on the banker's door. That door is actually where the independence of the empire ends. The banker does not offer the money as a sign of generosity. He has the king sign the document that mortgages the future of an empire. When the credit agreements are laid on the table, the king's eyes are only on the amount of money. The banker, however, looks far beyond the money. At the most strategic points of the empire, those silver mines, unexploited copper deposits, tax collection rights, customs revenues of ports, these are the real targets of the banker. Debt is taken for the empire's present. But the empire's tomorrows, its future, are demanded as collateral. While the king thinks he manages everything with an edict, the banker dictates under what legal cover, with what tax revenue, and with what mines income that edict will be financed. This is a flawless web of dependence. When the king cannot pay the debt, the banker's hand strengthens, and he begins to intervene in the king's political decisions. Whether a war will be started, which family a province will be left to with tax collection authority. It is no longer kings who decide, but those who hold the forbidden ledgers. The system puts empires into a cycle where they liquidate themselves. The king tries to win another war using the banker's gold. This new war means greater debts and greater collateral. Every new loan narrows the area of independence in the king's hands a little more. In the end, the king becomes nothing but a puppet. The owner of the throne is the king, but the true master of the empire is that shadow who finances every nail and fabric of that throne. This wasn't just a reality of the Middle Ages. This was the beginning of that great cycle where capital swallowed politics, where the bankruptcy of kings and the rise of bankers walked arm in arm. And in this cycle, the greatest danger was not the void in the treasury, but every signature you cast to fill that void, because every document you signed was actually a contract for your kingdom to slowly go into asset liquidation. The heavy oak-paneled doors of the Bardi bank in Florence could barely muffle the roar of the storm outside. The air inside was thick with the scent of fresh parchment, old ink, and that suffocating dampness created by despair. Elena breathed softly in the darkest corner of the room, as if she were merely a shadow. Her presence there as a young maid was natural enough not to attract anyone's attention. Yet she was one of the sharpest lockpickers the Medici had sent to Florence. Bardi, one of the bank's partners, threw the sealed letter from England onto the table in front of his partner. The man's voice tore through the silence of the room like a dagger. King Edward, he says he will not be able to pay his debts. As Elena approached the table to pour the next glass of wine, there was not the slightest tremor in her movements. This wasn't just a notice of non-payment. This was the beginning of that great liquidity crisis that broke the financial spine of Europe and would shake the entire continent. The sheer terror on Bardi's face as he sipped his wine was important data for Elena. This information was proof of how a king at the very top of an empire could liquidate an entire banking dynasty in seconds with a single edict. But there was something this king hadn't learned yet. What happens to a bank when he chooses to default on his debt? When Elena infiltrated the bank's secret archives that night after everyone had left, she knew exactly what she was looking for. She had to find not only King Edward's debts, but also the blackmail diplomacy documents that would be demanded of him in exchange for those unpayable debts. Behind the closed doors of the bedroom, those blackmail documents where kings turn their vulnerabilities into a trade commodity. Elena was a highly skilled spy, and she opened the ciphered lock of the study in seconds with a hairpin. The red leather-bound letters inside the safe whispered one by one with whom the king formed secret alliances to finance the war, and which noble women he had affairs with. When Elena encrypted these secrets and delivered them to the Medicis, the Bardi and Peruzzi banks would not only go bankrupt. The void created by that bankruptcy would crown the Medici's shadow authority with an absolute monopoly. Edward would not be able to keep his crown, and these data in the hands of this female spy were now powerful enough to end the future of a kingdom in a morning session of the stock market. Whether it was more profitable to liquidate a king or force his debt into default was now enough for Medici to press the button, considering the profit margin. While Elena continued her duties as a maid, getting up early for morning cleaning, the secret documents were already on their way to the Medici banks as normal mail. When a king cannot pay his debt, do bankers sitting at a single desk change the fate of an entire empire? To say yes to this question would be to oversimplify this massive system built. Because the Council of Shadows did not consist of a single body, a single name. It was a multi-headed, flawless algorithm that had evolved over centuries, mutated and seeped into the very veins of Europe. And every gear of this algorithm ruled the world in a different way. King Edward's default was the first test of this system, but it wouldn't be the last. Banks collapsed. Families were erased. But capital never perished. It merely changed shape and moved to safer, more ruthless ports. Because those who built the system were not only interested in gold, they were after the leveraged power that gold could buy. The true owners of the system were different factions that history books forgot to write about, running their operations far away from the battlefields. In this series, we will enter the operation rooms of these factions. For example, we will see the Medicis hiding behind the aesthetic and divine curtain of art. We will learn how they turned a statue, a painting into an espionage tool, and how they blessed blackmail with art through those flawless data miner women they infiltrated into the bedrooms of nobles. And not just them. We will travel to the era when money went underground and turned into a secret code system. We will decode the invisible shadow branch logic of the Knights Templar stretching from Jerusalem to Paris, how they became the first multinational bank, and then how they vanished overnight along with that massive secret. And we will look at the Hanseatic League, that merchant union that sees this flawless algorithm's dominance over the seas. We will watch how they condemned entire kingdoms to starvation using only embargoes, not weapons, and how they turned sea routes into a massive monopoly offshore system. We will seek the darkest secrets much further back in the heart of Rome. You will see that devastating liquidity crisis created by Julius Caesar using a vast empire like a massive hedge fund, and how he was manipulated through intimate diplomacy while playing the greatest financial gamble history has ever seen. In the Middle Ages, swords only killed bodies, but interest, debt, and blackmail bought the souls of kingdoms. They even managed to deceive the divine power of the church that forbade interest, financing even holy places. Then, profiting from the power of those beliefs, they used the donation money they obtained from all strata of the feudal system as an easy gateway to fund their next investments. If you think medieval history was written only with the sword, you are mistaken. The Middle Ages is a series of debt notes written by these shadow factions and merely signed by kings. And in every link of this series lies the vulnerabilities of those sitting on the throne, and the flawless calculations of those who turn those vulnerabilities into an investment. The blood on the battlefields dries. The magnificent crowns worn by kings eventually rust, and yesterday's epics of heroism turn into tomorrow's forgotten tales. However, the debt notes written in those dark and dim rooms, those intimate secrets processed into the forbidden ledgers, and the webs of dependence built with gold never perish. They merely change hands. We, as the Golden Thrones channel, are here to tear away the fake curtains of that romantic history we were taught. Even today, the noble knights of feudalism have long left their places to those silent and analytical calculators reading balance sheets. The marble floors of sacred offices began to be washed not with blood, but with exchange rate differences. The intimate room of kings transformed not into centers of carnal desire, but into the blackmail centers of flawless intelligence operations and hedonistic investments conducted by data miner women. On this channel, we will decode not the fake heroes of wars, but the invisible hands that start those wars with a single signature and end them with the same signature. We will enter the operation rooms of that massive Council of Shadows established above politics and armies, tracking the secret agreements, financial sabotages, and blackmail networks that truly shape our world. You will see with your own eyes how the vulnerabilities of those sitting on thrones turned into a massive, leveraged transaction. Because when you follow the trail of money, you will find no hero or saint. You will only see those who built the system and those who were liquidated under it. Gold does not lie, and the memory of the forbidden ledgers is never erased. Now we go to those dim rooms where this massive system was built, to the story of those who turned divine laws into marble steps leading to the greatest wealth in the world. In the next file, We will decode the Medici family, the bankers of God, who infiltrated the heart of the Vatican by turning sin into a flawless algorithm and making the Holy Seat their own bank branch. Welcome to the mysterious pages of the Golden Throne's archive. Follow the shadows, because the truth is much older and much deeper than you think.